So for the longest time, I've really wanted one of these peasant-style sundresses, but I haven't been able to find them in stores anywhere. If I'm being honest, I think it's because the style is a few years out of date, but I still really love it, so I decided to make my own. Now, instead of buying a sewing pattern for this design, I figured it would be easy enough to draft my own. I really love pattern drafting, but I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, so I'll try and keep the explanation as to how I drafted it pretty short. So I started with my basic bodice block, which is a pattern that I've altered to fit me pretty much perfectly, and I shifted all of that dartfulness into the shoulder dart so that it would be a bit more out of the way, and cut the bodice into these two sections. Then I widened those panels so that they could be gathered, and did the same thing with the back. For the sleeves, I just took a basic sleeve pattern from one of my other commercial sewing patterns and added a bit of fullness into that so that it would be a gathered sleeve. And for the skirt, I made a half circle skirt that was 1.5 times my waist measurement so that it could be gathered a bit, and then I cut out 2 of these 2-inch segments in the skirt so that the skirt is kind of tiered and ruffled like in the picture. And I made sure to leave a center front opening for the ties for the dress, and at the time I planned to do a center back opening, so I left that open as well. Here's all of my pattern pieces laid onto the fabric. As you can see, the bottom tier of the skirt had to be split into 2 pieces and seamed just so that it would fit on my fabric. And then I just pinned that and cut it out. The fabric I used is a cotton voile from Mood Fabrics. I used several years of reward points to buy this, and so it was pretty much free, which I really appreciated. This summer, I'm kind of trying to hold myself to not making anything vintage so that I could really focus on building out my wardrobe with versatile and not necessarily vintage pieces that I know I'll get a lot of wear out of. In this case, a semi-formal-ish sundress is always a good thing to have in your wardrobe to wear to events, but it is really tempting whenever I see a cool vintage style that I really want to research and recreate, but hopefully I'll have the time for those projects in the future. So the first thing I did was turn these 1-inch strips of fabric into all of the ties and straps that I would need for this dress. There's going to be fake ties gathering the back, in the sense that they're anchored into the side seam, and so adjusting the ties at the front doesn't affect the back, as well as ties on the front at the neckline, under bust, and around the entire waist, so I knew I needed quite a bit. So first I stitched down the entire length of the tie, then cut the seam allowance to about 1/4 inch. Most of the time, to turn fabric inside out in cases like this, people use a safety pin, but a safety pin was a bit too wide to fit through these narrow ties, so I had to get a bit creative. I tried a few methods, but the one that ended up working best for me was taking a length of crochet cotton, threading a large-eyed yarn needle with it, and tying it to the end of the fabric. With that tied as securely as possible, I could then thread the needle through the entire length of fabric, with some difficulty turn it inside out through that. I obviously cut out a lot of the footage, but it was really difficult to get this to turn in on itself smoothly. With that, I started constructing the back of the bodice, so I just sewed the upper back to the lower back, and also added a 2-inch facing to the top edge, which I'll turn into the casing for the ties that will gather the back. For the seam between the upper back and the lower back, I wanted to use the seam allowance to create a casing that I could then thread the ties through, so I looked in my 1940s sewing guide to see what sort of seams I could use. There are 2 seams that could serve this purpose, the welt seam and the flat felled seam. I decided to go with the welt seam, which is basically one side of the seam allowance cut to 1/4 inch, and then the other side of the seam allowance folded over that and stitched down. For the welt seam, all of that work is done on the inside of the garment. Meanwhile, for the flat felled seam, it's all done on the outside. They're both going to end up looking pretty much the same for this dress, especially because it is a gathered style, but I decided to go with the welt seam because there's a right and wrong side of the print, and that would have showed if I used the flat felled seam. For the binding on the top edge, that worked a bit differently. I just cut both of the sides of the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch, also trimmed the binding because it was too long, and then folded that over itself to create a nicely finished top edge that also has a channel for the ties. Then I could thread those ties through the casing, so I threaded a large-eyed yarn needle and passed the ties through those channels. This part was also surprisingly difficult, and I had to do it so many times throughout the dress. Then, to gather the back panel of the dress, I pinned the piece onto my dress form and used the lines on the dress form to align how much I should gather the dress. And there you can see it's just really easy to pull in the excess fabric so that it's gathered to be the width of my back. And I also used the machine to secure the ties in place and hold that gathering. Next, I did the exact same thing for the front panels. As you can see, here I'm threading the ties through the channels on the top edge and the underbust, just like I did for the back. The only difference was that in order to have a cleanly finished front edge, I used the needle to puncture the fabric about ½ an inch before the front edge so that the ties come out kind of like a makeshift eyelet, and then I could fold back that extra ½ inch and finish the front edge. If I had thought about this in advance, I probably would have done an actual eyelet around this opening so that it doesn't wear down over time, but this solution worked as well. Then I sewed the side seams, sewing the front of the bodice to the back. Also, because I was at the machine, I sewed the sleeves together into tubes. And I also gathered the top edge of the sleeve using 2 lines of gathering threads just to make it a bit neater. And one last thing, I also sewed the very bottom of the sleeve to the bodice. The sleeve and the bodice actually only connect at the very bottom of the underarm, instead of setting the sleeve into an armhole as you would usually do. Then I pinned the bodice to the dress form, gathering the front to fit in order to tighten the gathering on the sleeve and then bind that. At this point, I realized that the neckline was a bit too low, and I didn't think it looked proportional enough. I think that was the only error that I could have made during the pattern drafting process, because everything else in this dress was so forgiving, being gathered to fit, so I guess I should have more thoroughly checked my pattern. There wasn't much I could do about that, save basically reconstructing the entire dress, so that's what I ended up doing. I cut another upper front bodice piece that was a bit higher, and then seam ripped all of the seams that held the top bodice piece in place, and then swapped in this piece. But as part of that process, I had to redo a lot of the casings and threading in the ties, so it took quite a bit of work to make this change. In the end though, I'm really happy that I did, because I think it makes the dress look a lot better. Anyway, resuming construction, I sewed a strip of binding to each sleeve to keep it gathered and finish the raw edge. Pretty self-explanatory for the sleeve binding, just trimming down the seam allowance and then taking that binding and folding it over, tucking in all of the raw edges, then stitching over that to secure it down. The sleeves would definitely fit better if I inserted some sort of elastic, but I didn't have any on me, so I do have to use safety pins to keep the sleeves comfortably on my shoulders. The bodice was pretty much done at this point, so I moved on to the skirt. I added gathering threads to the waist and the top edges of all of the tiers that had to be gathered into the tier above them. And I didn't bother with a double length of gathering threads because with really long lengths of gathering, it just increases the chance that you're going to break a thread, so I just settled for the single rows. Then I could gather up all of those panels and pin them to the panel above them and sew it around. When making the skirt, I found that once you pull the gathering threads and distribute the gathers along them, it's very hard to pull the gathers all the way out. Like there's always going to be a certain level of gathering in that thread that it's hard to then flatten out. So you'll notice that each panel has too much gathering for the row above it, and I couldn't really do anything to fix that. So I kind of took a bit of a risk and assumed that the bodice was slightly less than 1.5 times my waist measurement in width, so I was hoping I would have more skirt than bodice, then just sew it all together and cut off the excess skirt. I hope that makes sense. I just sewed the rest of the tiers of the skirt together, then sewed that to the bodice. Thankfully, the risk I took paid off, and I proceeded with turning one of the sides of the seam allowance into a casing for the drawstring. As you can see, here I'm cutting off that excess amount of skirt fabric. I originally planned on doing a center back opening with a zipper, but after trying on the dress, I realized that I would have enough room to get it on and off, just using the drawstrings at the front, so I just sewed up the back seam without the zipper. Then I took a bit of length off the skirt and did a double fold hem, and I did the same thing at the sleeves. With that, the dress is finished. I'm really happy with how this dress came out. There's really not much I would change about it. I think extending the front panel really helped, and I'm very glad that I did it. I think the design is really forgiving in terms of fit because the front can just be adjusted using the drawstrings, and I guess if I had to choose something I would change, probably would be to add pockets, though that would have been pretty difficult without having a side seam and not the strongest in this lightweight fabric. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I've got plenty of other projects coming up this summer, so if you don't want to miss that, feel free to subscribe, and thanks so much for watching.